Greetings! Today, we are approaching Passover. We may even enter into it. Saturday, March 25th, 30 AD. Jesus, with Obed, served in the temple, and the other disciples of Jerusalem went again to the temple for the celebration of the Sabbath. They stood 2 by 2 among the young Israelites. Jesus wore a white woven robe with a girdle and a white mantle like those used by the Essenes, but there was something very distinguished about him. His clothing looked remarkably fresh and elegant, probably because he wore it. He chanted and prayed with the parchment rolls in turn with the others. There were some prayer leaders present. The people were again struck at the sight of Jesus. They were astonished. They wondered at him, though without having said a word to him. Even among themselves they did not speak openly of him, but I saw the wonderful impression made on many. There were 3 instructions or discourses delivered. One on the children of Israel, another on their departure from Egypt, and a third on the Paschal Lamb. On one of the altars was a sacrifice of incense. The priest could not be seen, though the fumes in the fire were visible. The fire could be seen through a kind of grating upon which there was something like a Paschal Lamb surrounded by raisin ornaments through which sparkled the fire. This altar stood near the Holy of Holies, its horns apparently entering in it. I saw Pharisees praying, some of them wearing wrapped around one arm a long, narrow band that had perhaps once been used as a veil. About 2 in the afternoon, Jesus went with his companions into an apartment in the court of Israel, where a repast of fruit and rolls had been prepared. The rolls were twisted like braids or plaited hair. The steward had been engaged to see to everything. All necessaries could be bought or ordered in the precincts of the temple itself, and strangers had the right to avail themselves of the privilege. The temple was so large that it seemed like a little city, and in it one could procure everything. During this repast, Jesus gave an instruction. When the men had finished, the women took some refreshment. I learned on that day what before I had not known, that is, that Lazarus held a position in the temple as amongst us a burgomaster may also be a church warden. He went around with a box and took up a collection. Jesus and his followers remained the whole afternoon in the temple. I did not see him back in Bethany before 9 o'clock that night. There were innumerable lamps and lights in the temple on the Sabbath. Mary and the other holy women had now left Capernaum to go to Jerusalem. Their route lay toward Nazareth and past Tabor, from which district other women came to join them, and then off through Samaria. They were preceded by the disciples from Galilee and followed by servants with their baggage. Among the disciples were Peter, Andrew, and their half-brother Jonathan, the sons of Zebedee, the sons of Mary Cleophas, Nathanael Chased, and Nathanael the bridegroom. Sunday, March 26th. On the 4th of Nisan, Jesus spent the whole morning at the temple with about 20 disciples, after which he taught at Mary Mark's and took a luncheon. He afterward returned to Bethany and went with Lazarus to Simon the Pharisees. Already, many of the lambs brought to the temple had been rejected by the priests. Monday, Jesus was again in the temple and in the afternoon taught at Joseph of Arimathea's, not far from the home of John Mark, and near a stonecutter's yard. It was a retired quarter of the city and little frequented by the Pharisees. At this period, no one feared to be seen in company with Jesus, for hatred against him had not yet been manifested. Tuesday, March 28th. Jesus continued to show himself still more freely and boldly throughout Jerusalem and in the temple. He went on with Obed, even to the place between the altar of sacrifice and the temple, where an instruction was being delivered to the priests relative to Passover and its ceremonies. The disciples remained back in the court of Israel. The Pharisees were greatly annoyed at seeing him present at that instruction. Jesus also addressed the people on the streets. The crowds flowing into Jerusalem kept continually increasing, especially workmen, day laborers, servants, and dealers in the necessaries of life. Around the city and on the open places, crowds of huts and tents had been erected for the accommodation of the multitudes flocking for Passover. Many lambs and other cattle had been brought into the city, from the former of which selections had already begun. Numbers of pagans also came to Jerusalem for the feast. Wednesday, March 29th. Jesus taught and cured openly in Bethany. Even 6 strangers were brought to him. Some relatives of Zechariah from the country of Hebron came to invite him to thither. He went up again to the temple. When the priests left after the services, on the place where he was standing among his disciples, Jesus taught them and other good people upon the nearness of the kingdom of God, the Passover solemnity, the approaching fulfillment of all the prophecies and symbols, yes, even of the Paschal Lamb itself. His words were earnest and severe, and several priests who were still going here and there in the temple were troubled at his discourse and secretly annoyed. Jesus then went back to Bethany, and that night, accompanied by some of the disciples, left with the envoys for Hebron, about 4 hours to the south. Preparations for the feast were actively going on in the temple, and many changes were being made in the interior. Halls and corridors were opened, stands and partitions were removed. The altar could now be approached from many sides, and everything presented quite a different appearance. Thursday, March 30th. Now we're Nisan the 8th. Jesus and the disciples and Zechariah's relatives proceeded to Hebron by the route running between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. It was at most a journey of 5 hours. Passing through Jetta, Jesus entered the neighboring city Hebron, where he taught and quietly cured many sick. Friday, he returned to Bethany for the Sabbath. His way led high over the mountains, whose exposure to the sun made it very hot. The disciples that had come from John to Jesus in Bethany now went back to the former. Saturday, April 1st, Nisan 10. Jesus went to the temple on the Sabbath, and with Obed penetrated into the court containing the teacher's chair, from which later on he also taught. Priests and Levites were sitting on the circular seats around the chair, from which a discourse on the Passover festival was being delivered. The entrance of Jesus threw the assembly into consternation, especially when he started objections and asked questions to which not one of them could answer. Among other things, he told them that the time was approaching when the symbolical Paschal Lamb would give place to the reality. Then would the temple and its services come to an end. The language of Jesus was figurative, and yet so clear that my thoughts instantly reverted to the words of the Pange Lingua. Et antiquum documentum novu cedat ritui. When they questioned him as to how he knew that, he answered that his father had told him, but he did not say who that father was. The Pharisees were highly displeased, though at the same time full of astonishment. They did not venture to contradict him. Access to that part of the temple was not permitted to all, but Jesus had entered in quality of prophet. In his last year, he even taught therein. After the Sabbath, Jesus went to Bethany. I had not as yet seen him conversing with Mary the silent. Her end, I think, was near, for she appeared greatly changed. She was lying on the ground on a grey carpet, supported in the arms of her maids, and she was in a kind of swoon. She appeared to me to have drawn nearer to this world of ours, as if she had ever been absent in spirit, but now she appeared to have been brought back again to life. She was now to know that this Jesus here in Bethany, who lived in her own time and in her own vicinity, was he who had to suffer so cruelly. She was still alive in order to experience through compassion in her own person the sufferings of Jesus, after which she was soon to die. On the night of Saturday, Jesus visited her and conversed long with her. Part of the time she sat up on her couch, and part of the time walked around her chamber. She had now the perfect use of her senses. She distinguished between the present and the future. She recognized in Jesus the Savior and the Paschal Lamb, and she knew that he was to suffer frightfully. All this made her inexpressibly sorrowful. The world appeared to her gloomy and an insupportable weight. But most of all was she grieved at man's ingratitude, which she foresaw. Jesus spoke long with her of the approach of the kingdom of God and his own passion, after which he gave her his blessing and left her. She was soon to die. She was tall and extraordinarily beautiful, white as snow and shining with light. Her hands were like ivory, her fingers long and tapering. Sunday, April 2nd. Next morning, Jesus cured openly in Bethany many that had been brought to him. Among them some strangers that had come up for the feast. Some were lame, some were blind. There came to him also several men connected with the temple, who called him to account for his actions and conduct. Who, they asked, had authorized him on the preceding day to take part in the conference held in the temple? Jesus answered them very gravely, and again spoke of his Father. The Pharisees dared not enter the lists against him. They felt a certain terror in his presence. They did not know what to make of him. But next day Jesus taught again in the temple. All the Galilean disciples that had been at the marriage feast in Cana had now come to Jesus. Mary and the holy women were stopping with Mary Mark. Lazarus brought many of the lambs that had been rejected as not fit for the feast, and had them slaughtered and divided among the poor day laborers and other workmen. Subtext: Jesus turns the vendors out of the courts of the temple. The Paschal Supper, death of Mary the Silent. So this is a new major subsection. I won't be covering all of it today. Unlikely anyway. Monday, April 3rd, Nisan 12. When Jesus, with all his disciples, went to the temple, he found there, ranged around the court of the suppliants, dealers in green herbs, birds, and all kinds of eatables. In a kindly and friendly manner, he accosted them and bade them retire with their goods to the court of the Gentiles. He admonished them gently of the impropriety of taking up a position where the bleating of the lambs and the noise of the other cattle would disturb the recollection of the worshippers. With the help of the disciples, he assisted the dealers to remove their tables to the places that he pointed out to them. Tuesday, April the 4th. On this day, Jesus cured many sick strangers in Jerusalem, chiefly poor, lame, working people who dwelt in the neighborhood of the cenacle on Mount Zion. There was an astonishingly great multitude gathered in Jerusalem. The city was surrounded by a perfect encampment of huts and tents. On the large open places ran building after building, forming long streets wherein all things could be had in large quantities, such as tents everything necessary for their erection, and whatever was needed for the eating of the Paschal lamb. There were other stores also in which such things could be bought or hired. Crowds of day laborers and poor people from all parts of Israel were busy carrying the above-mentioned articles here and there and putting them up. These people had been at work a long time in Jerusalem, clearing away whatever might block up the streets, clipping the hedges, opening the roads, leveling and measuring off the grounds for encampments, and putting up booths and stalls. In the same way, for weeks before, the roads and bad crossing places in the country around were being repaired and made ready for travel. All these preparations referred to the Paschal Lamb, just as the Baptist's preparing of the ways referred to the true Lamb of God. When Jesus again went up to the temple with his disciples, he admonished the dealers a second time to withdraw. Since all the passages were open on account of the immolation of the Paschal Lamb soon to take place, many had again crowded up to the court of the suppliants. Jesus bade them withdraw and shoved their tables away. He acted with more vehemence than on the last occasion. The disciples opened a way for him through the crowd. Some of the dealers became furious. With violent gesticulations of heads and hands, they resisted him, and then it was that Jesus, stretching out his hand, pushed back one of the tables. They were powerless against him. The place was soon emptied, and all things carried to the exterior court. Then Jesus addressed to them words of warning. He said that twice he had admonished them to remove their goods, and that if he found them there again, he would treat them still more severely. The most insolent insulted him with, "What will the Galilean, the scholar from Nazareth, dare to do? We are not afraid of him." These taunts began at the moment of their removal. Many were standing around looking at Jesus in amazement. The devout Jews approved his action and praised him in his absence. They also cried out, "The prophet of Nazareth." The Pharisees, who were ashamed and angry at what had occurred, had for days past privately warned the people to refrain from attaching themselves to the stranger during the feast, not to run after him, nor even to speak much about him. But the people had become more and more interested in Jesus, for there were already many among them who had heard his teaching or had been cured by him. As Jesus left the temple, he passed a cripple in one of the courts. The man cried after him. Jesus cured him. And he who had been lame, going into the temple, joyfully proclaimed Jesus as his benefactor. Upon this, great excitement arose. John the Baptist did not come to the feast. He was not a Jew under the law, nor was he at all like other men. He was, as it were, a voice clothed with flesh. He had at this time a fresh concourse of aspirants to baptism on account of the multitudes going to Jerusalem. All was very quiet in Jerusalem that evening. The people were busy in their own homes with cleansing out the leaven and preparing the unleavened bread. All the cooking utensils were covered and hung away. This was done also at Lazarus's on Mount Zion, where Jesus and his followers were to eat the Paschal lamb. Jesus himself was present at these preparations. He gave instructions upon them, and all was done by his direction. But the minutiae were not so punctiliously observed as among the other Jews. Jesus explained of what it all was a figure, and how it should be practiced, showing them at the same time what the Pharisees, through want of understanding, had added. Wednesday, April 5th. Jesus did not appear in the temple the next day. He remained in Bethany. I thought, as so many vendors had again crowded into the temple, something would surely have happened to them had he been there. That afternoon the Paschal lambs were slaughtered in the temple, and that with indescribable order and celerity. Everyone brought his Paschal lamb on his shoulder and took his place in order, for there was room enough for all. There were 3 courts around the altar in which they could stand, but the space between it and the temple was not open to the people. They that did the slaughtering were behind railings, a table with all that was necessary for their work before them. But they were placed so close to one another that the blood of one lamb sprinkled over the neighboring butcher. Their clothes were full of blood. The priests were ranged in several rows up to the altar, passing basins from hand to hand, some full of blood, others empty. Before disemboweling a lamb, the Israelites pressed and kneaded it in a certain way. Then the butcher standing next in order held the animal, while his neighbor with a light grasp easily tore out the intestines. The flaying was done very expeditiously. They loosened a little piece of skin and fastened it to a round stick provided for the purpose. Then they hung the lamb around their neck, with both hands twisted the stick around, the skin rolled up on it. Toward evening the slaughter was over. The evening sky was blood red. Lazarus, Obed, and Saturnin slaughtered the 3 lambs that Jesus and his friends were to eat. The meal was taken at Lazarus's on Mount Zion. It was a large building with 2 wings. The oven for roasting was in the dining hall, but it was very different from the hearth in the cenacle. It was higher, like the fireplace in Anna and Mary's house, also like that in Cana. In the thick perpendicular wall that was formed it were holes wherein the lamb was fastened. It was stretched out and pinned in place with wooden skewers, just as if crucified. The hall was beautifully ornamented, and the table at which they ate in 3 groups was exactly like a horizontal cross. At the upper and shorter end of the cross, upon which were many dishes of bitter herbs, Lazarus sat. The paschal lambs were placed, one in each of the arms of the cruciform table, and one toward the middle of the lower beam. Jesus, Peter, Saturnin, and Obed sat as follows: Jesus and Peter opposite each other at the left arm of the table, Obed at the right arm, and Saturnin at the lower beam. Around Jesus stood his relatives and disciples from Galilee, around Obed and Lazarus those from Jerusalem, while John's disciples gathered around Saturnin. There were present in all over 30. The Passover supper was very different from Jesus' last Passover supper, more strictly Judaical. Each here held the staff in his hand, was girded as for a journey, and all ate in haste. Jesus had 2 staves placed crosswise before him. They chanted psalms and, standing, quickly consumed the paschal lambs. Later on, they placed themselves at table in a recumbent position. This supper was different also from the customary among the other Jews at this feast. Jesus explained all to the guests, but omitted the ceremonies that had been added by the Pharisees. He carved the 3 lambs himself and served at table, saying that he did it as their servant. They remained together far into the night, singing and praying. Jerusalem was so still and solemn during the whole day. The Jews not engaged in the slaughtering of the lambs remained shut up in their houses, which were ornamented with dark green foliage. The immense multitude of people were, after the slaughtering, so busy in the interior of their homes, and all was so still, that it produced upon me quite a melancholy impression. I saw on that day also where all the paschal lambs for the numerous strangers, of whom many were encamped before the gates, were roasted. Both outside and inside the city there were built on certain places long, low walls, but so broad that one could walk on them. In these walls were furnace after furnace, and at certain distances lived men who attended to them and received a small remuneration for their services. At these furnaces travelers and strangers could, at the different feasts or at any other time, roast their meat and cook any kind of food. Their consuming of the fat of the paschal lambs went on in the temple far into the night. After the first watch, the altar was purified and the doors thrown open at the very early hour in the next morning. Jesus and his disciples spent the night in prayer, and with but little sleep at Lazarus's on Mount Zion, the disciples from Galilee slept in the wings of the building. Now, normally I would end the reading here, but there's only like one other page, so I'm going to read that, and then it's going to skip. It goes through the rest of the month pretty quickly, so I'll just do this now. Subtext, year 2. So obviously the years are divided by the Passover. We are at Nisan the 15th, so we are at Passover now. At daybreak they went up to the temple, which was lighted by numerous lamps, and to which people were already flocking from all parts with their offerings. Jesus took his stand in one of the courts with his disciples and there taught. A crowd of vendors had again pressed into the court of the suppliants and even into that of the women. There were scarcely 2 steps from the worshippers. As they still came crowding in, Jesus bade the newcomers to keep back, and those that had already taken their position to withdraw. But they resisted, and called upon the guard nearby for help. The latter, not venturing to act on themselves, reported what was taking place to the Sanhedrin. Jesus, meantime, persisted in his command to the vendors to withdraw. When they boldly refused, he drew from the folds of his robe a cord of twisted reeds of slender willow branches and pushed up the ring that held the ends confined. Thereupon one half of it opened out into numerous threads like a whip. With this he rushed upon the vendors, overthrew their tables, and drove back those that resisted, while the disciples, pressing on right and left, shoved his opponents away. And now came a crowd of priests from the Sanhedrin and summoned Jesus to say who had authorized him to behave so in the first place. Jesus answered that although the holy mystery had been taken away from the temple, yet it had not ceased to be a sacred place, and one to which the prayer of so many just was directed. It was not a place of usury, fraud, and for low and noisy traffic. Jesus, having alleged the commands of his Father, they asked who was his Father. He answered that he had no time then to explain that point to men, and even if he did, they would not understand. Saying which, he turned away from them and continued his chase of the vendors. 2 companies of soldiers now arrived on the spot, but the priests did not dare to take action against Jesus. They themselves were ashamed of having tolerated such abuse. The crowd gathered around, declared Jesus in the right, and the soldiers even lent a hand to remove the vendors' stands and to clear away the overturned tables and wares. Jesus and the disciples drove the vendors to the exterior court, but those that were modestly selling doves, little rolls, and other needful refreshments in the recesses of the wall around the inner court, he did not molest. After that, he and his followers went to the court of Israel. It may have been between 7 and 8 in the morning when all this took place. On the evening of this day, a kind of procession went out along the valley of Kidron to cut the first fruits of the harvest. Friday, April 7th, Nisan 16. Jesus, on one of the succeeding days, cured in the court of the temple about 10 persons, some lame, some mute, and it gave rise to great excitement, for the cure filled the whole place with their acclamations of joy. Again he was summoned to answer for his conduct, which he did in severe words. The people were enthusiastic in his favor. After the divine service, Jesus and the disciples attended the instruction given in a hall of the temple. The text was from one of the books of Moses. Jesus offered some objections, for it was a kind of conference in which questions might be raised. He silenced his opponents and gave an explanation of the disputed points very different from what had before been given. During all these days, Jesus hardly saw his mother. She was staying with Mary Mark, passing the livelong day in anxiety, tears, and prayer on account of the excitement roused by the appearance of her son. Saturday, April 8th, Nisan the 17th. Jesus kept the Sabbath at Lazarus's in Bethany, whither he had retired after the tumult occasioned by the cures wrought in the temple. After the Sabbath, the Pharisees went to the house of Mary Mark in Jerusalem, thinking to find Jesus there and to take him into custody. They were, however, disappointed. They did not find him, but only his mother and the other holy women whom, as the followers of Jesus, they commanded with harsh words to leave the city. The mother of Jesus and the other women became greatly troubled at hearing this, and in tears hurried to Martha and Bethany. Mary, weeping, entered the room wherein Martha was with her sick sister Mary the Silent. The latter was again quite wrapped in ecstasy. All that she had hitherto seen in spirit she now beheld about to be fulfilled. She could no longer endure the pain it caused her, and she died in the presence of Mary, Cleophas, Martha, and the other women. Nicodemus, in spite of the open persecution directed against Jesus, visited him during these days by invitation from Lazarus. I saw Jesus during the night reclining next to him on the ground and instructing him. Now here, this is the episode of John 3, 1-21. They didn't put it in the text. I don't think she mentioned it. Sunday, April 9th. Nisan 18. Before daybreak, both started for Jerusalem, where they went to Lazarus's on Zion. Here came Joseph of Arimathea also to see Jesus. He conversed with them. They humbled themselves before him, telling him that they did indeed discern that he was more than human, and that they pledged him lasting fidelity. Jesus commanded them secrecy, and they begged him to remember them kindly. After all the other disciples who had eaten the paschal lamb with him came to Jesus, he gave them his commands and instructions for the near future. Extending to him their hands, they wept, making use of the narrow scarf they wore around their neck or wound around their head to dry their tears. Now, the very next week, Monday, April 10th, Monday, April 17th, this is just italicized. Also from April 18th to Tuesday, April 25th. So we're ripping through the rest of Nisan. There's nothing much to say. And now we're in the month of Iyar, but again, it ends on an italicized text. So the next time I read will be, let's see, to cross by all the pictures here. The letter of King Abgar, I guess. It'll be early May, Wednesday, May the 3rd. So that's it for the time being. I guess we've just started year 2. Pange Lingua gloriosi. That phrase, et antiquum documentum novoque dat ritui, it has a note in the book. It was written by St. Thomas Aquinas, and it is translated as, over ancient forms of worship, newer rites of grace prevail. I imagine those rites were inspired, though, by great saints and uncover the mysteries of God, like the doctors of the church, like St. Catherine of Siena with her 9 levels of prayer, and St. Thomas Aquinas, not inspired by some hippie with a guitar singing Fred Penner kind of songs and calling it liturgical music. Let beauty come from true artists, those with great minds and talent reaching into the mysteries of the faith. Those people like St. Thomas Aquinas, like Hildegard von Bingen. So, next note. I'm going to talk about the the whole merchants in the temple incident. So first warning, move your stuff elsewhere, please. The second warning is, hey, get it out, get it out. The third warning is, now we're at, see this table? This is what it looks like turned on its back. Crish, crash, whiplash, whiplash. Yeah. And then the merchant's going, no, my money, thieves. I may have been inspired by the several Jesus movies I saw on the matter. Anyways, Americans could learn a really, really good lesson from this, and Jews especially. But they didn't learn the lesson the first time, I suppose. It's a discourse on economy and very relevant in our time. Economy is a low-level thing, low-level human nature. It is not to be put above culture. It is not to be put above art. It's not to be put above theology. Therefore, you should not make money with culture. You should not make money with art, with politics, with law. Those things are above the economy. But here we are. So anyways, we have the same thing happening here. Now, what I'll say is, economy, all men should develop trades around the age of 12. You should work to fulfill the punishment of Genesis 3. We should all toil. Even St. Paul says this. And St. Paul was a tent maker, tent weaver or whatever. He said every man must earn his keep, right? So I was sort of deprived of this myself, and so were many people in our time. So we obviously have a lot to make up for. But a lot of men are disenfranchised in the West because the education system tries to subvert away the punishment of Genesis 3. Now, a lot of the jobs we're exposed to, they tax us too much to be able to live a spiritual life. They actually cut us off from God. And you remember how I used to say, well, what I liked about the shepherds is that they had a natural catechesis in their work. Well, in the work we can find out these days, in our day, we don't have natural catechesis in that work. It's very artificial. So in this world, we're taught that we're supposed to go educate ourselves in order to skirt the hard work. Then people educate themselves and they realize that they still have to work in warehouses, cubicles, and as waiters and whatever. And most of them encounter a crisis. On top of that, employment is hard to come by because the job market is oversaturated because of women having entered the workforce, which is another lie that serves the usurers quite well. Because now, with the oversaturation of the job markets, people have to work longer and harder hours and receive less pay. It also drastically reduces the quality of employment to having to work for some faceless corporate giant. Let's not forget the fact that we have to pay about 30 to 40% of our income to the government. And that's just income. That doesn't count property taxes and goods and services taxes. So, on top of that, it drastically reduces the quality of employment to have to work for some. Yes, I just said that. Many of the people in our time, might have preferred slavery because at least their names might have been remembered. But here the Pharisees permit the merchants to come in and corporatize the Passover. And yes, it is as stupid as it sounds. They come in, set up shop, and they see it as a financial opportunity. Go supply what is demanded. Oh, such genius, such genius. Merchants always think they're the smartest people in the world. Except it turns into a massive distraction. That rather than men expressing their passion for God in a sacred silence, like a Eucharistic adoration, that's what we do now. Imagine if you went to Eucharistic adoration and there was a cantina there selling hot dogs. Now, it obviously intrudes on the sanctity of the moment. The process kept, it turns into a money racket. And this is what economics does to everybody. In everyone's restless pursuit of mammon and becoming rich, their passions are all killed in favor of that one passion: to be richer than everyone else, to be better than everyone else, to be more elite than everyone else, to get the prettier wife than everyone else has. They become soulless husks in this pursuit, and they are utterly destined for hell because they've done nothing profitable with their pilgrimage. Not profitable to their soul, at least. Even now you watch TV, all you see is a marketplace. I watch hockey and golf. These were childhood passions, and they persist. But both are so marketed that it's hard. In Golf Channel is all pharmaceutical marketing. So I know that they're going to encounter some sort of crisis if Robert Francis Kennedy decides to axe pharmaceutical commercials. Those guys would be scrambling. But anyways, let's put it this way. Now, the Cup, the NHL, they win a trophy called the Stanley Cup. It was named Stanley after Lord Stanley from late 1800s. And they just kept that name. Now imagine if some corporation bought the Stanley Cup and decided we're going to rename it the Rogers Cup or something silly like that, or rename it the McDonald's Cup. Now, this is what they actually do in golf. Now, you have the traditional, the majors, right? The green jacket, very prized, and because Augusta is like the mecca of golf. And then you have the Wanamaker, I think it's called. Sorry, I keep calling it the wrong thing. I don't remember what the U.S. Open trophy is called, and the Claret Jug. But then they play at the end of the season for the FedEx Cup. Now, the FedEx Cup is the one that pays out the most, naturally. But golfers really don't care about that. They're not like, oh, I celebrate my season well because I thrive for the ultimate goal, the FedEx Cup. What kind of tradition is that? How is one supposed to be passionate? And passion is what sells. It's why the World Juniors are often better than the NHL playoffs. Passion is what sells. And the Four Nations. Everybody loved that tournament this year because it was a hotly contested contest between Canada and the U.S. because of Trump's 51st state stuff. And you saw how the players wanted to play. They wanted to put their bodies on the line. And that's what drew everyone's attention because it was passionate. It was about something bigger than some corporation. Well, here we have the same lesson. How empty does your soul have to be thinking about profit during the Passover? And yet, this is why Jesus drove out the mammon seekers out of the temple. It's supposed to be that one time of year where men have the most intimate moment with God, and instead it turns into a pandemonium, a grand corporate affair, the opposite of what it's supposed to be. So I have a few more notes. Jesus came not to bring peace, but the sword. Now, his contentions in Jerusalem are the beginning of the justice deserved for that city. Now imagine what our times are going to be like when Jesus decides to pull the arrow out of this wound. And we get that in the gospel as well when he laments over Jerusalem. And this is right before his passion. So we're still 3 years out. This is 30 AD. So he has to come to Jerusalem 3 more times because Passover was mandatory for all men in Israel. So, like I said before, it's like pulling an arrow out of a wound. Where you start to tug, you feel that immense piercing pain, right? You just, or they say rip the Band-Aid off rather than tearing it off slowly. Well, this is the kind of wound that's so deep that you can't tear it out quickly. Now, and out of the agony of you having your arrow pulled out, you'll be writhing and kicking. So the first major tug of the arrow had to take place in 30 AD. But if he had done more, it would have upset the Jews so much that they'd have put him to death then and there. But his time had not yet come. So the Jews were very much attached to the errors introduced them by the man-made precepts and doctrines, which obviously included the corporatization of the Passover. Next, we come upon the death of Mary the Silent. We contrast it with the eventual death of the Virgin Mary. Mary the Silent's poor little heart could not endure even the thought of what was going to take place because of how much she already loved the Christ. And yet, Mary, the Mother of God, had to endure much more than that. There was an anecdote I heard that this woman saw her husband and daughter killed instantly before her because they were hit by a car or something like that, and she started to sweat blood. Well, needless to say, much blood was sweat by Mary on that day. So, what it tells us about the Mother of God is the same thing as what Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea told Jesus, that she was more than human. Last note, notice that Jesus told Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea what to do. Like Lazarus, they weren't apostles or disciples, but they had their special roles to play. In the coming times, I do believe many of us will be revealed these special roles because the advent of AI means the microchip is really close. Awfully close. And so the times are annealing towards the great catastrophe, that chastisement that God is about to expose to the world, the arrow being pulled out of the wound. So remember that God has plans for us all, and though we might not necessarily, they might not necessarily be the most romantic plans, but they're vital nevertheless. So pray, stay vigilant, and keep in that listening state. Ave Maria.